Hello, book lovers, and welcome to the 125th episode of Authors Love Bookstores from a Mighty Blaze. I'm your host, Joe Moldover, and I'm so happy to be here with you today. Every week, I, along with my partner and fellow writer, Kimberly Hensel-Lorance, crisscross North America and beyond, visiting independent bookstores and the authors who love them. And this week, for the first time, we are in the great state of Mississippi at Square Books with General Manager Lynn Roberts and author Snowden Wright. Lynn and Snowden, welcome to the program.
Thank you for having us.
Snowden Wright is the author of the novel American Pop, a Wall Street Journal Book of the Month, a selection for Barnes & Noble's Discover Great New Writers program, Southern Independent Booksellers Alliance Okra Pick, and NPR Favorite Book of the Year. Snowden is a graduate of Dartmouth College and Columbia University. He's written for The Atlantic, Salon, Esquire, The Millions, and the New York Daily News, among others. Snowden was the visiting writer and prose faculty at the 2021 Longleaf Writers Conference, and his debut novel, Play Pretty Blues, won the 2012 Summer Literary Seminars Grey Wolf Prize. Snowden is at work on his third novel, which we will be discussing. Snowden, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you for having me.
Lynn Roberts is the general manager at Square Books. We have met with now 125 plus independent booksellers from all across the country, as well as Canada and the United Kingdom. And very few of them have the gravitas and history of Square Books in Oxford, Mississippi, literally in the shadow of William Faulkner. Lynn, thank you so much for being here with us.
Oh, I'm delighted. Thank you for the invitation.
Snowden, we're with Square because they are your sort of beloved independent bookseller. I wonder if you would say a little bit about what is so special about Square Books.
I grew up in a small town in Mississippi, Meridian, Mississippi, and for much of my childhood, we didn't have a bookstore. And so therefore we had to find them. And in Mississippi, we're fortunate to have an I-85 book access, of which I live kind of in the middle now. On the southern end is Lemuria Books in Jackson, Mississippi, and the northern end is Square Books in Oxford. And growing up, going to see a football game with my family, Square Books was an oasis for me, a place to find literature that I normally wouldn't have been able to find in my hometown because we didn't have, for a large amount of time, a bookstore. And even beyond that, they've always had an excellent curation of books, and you can always get expert recommendations from their booksellers. And I think one of the best features of Square Books is their stellar lineup of guest authors and events. I would hold their calendar of events up to any bookstore in the country. And for me personally, recently, when my first book came out, it was with a small press, and Square Books was kind enough to host me for a reading there. And that was in 2013. Then in 2014, I was beginning work on my second novel, and I was still living in New York City. And I was also working a day job. And so I was finding it very difficult to complete the novel with that sort of workload. And around that time, sadly, my grandfather passed away. And with the small inheritance he left me, this wasn't a fortune, but it was enough to live on for a year or two. I decided to honor his memory and his generosity by using that money to move back to my home state, which had been his home state, and work on my second novel full time. And so I moved to Oxford primarily because it's such a literary town. It is a haven for writers and artists of all kinds, and the beating heart of that literary community is Square Books. And so I was living in a townhouse down the road from Square Books, and that was always a home away from home, a way to go and be around the literary scene and meet other writers and be inspired by that. And so I really have Square Books to thank in that respect for the writing of American Pop.
That's wonderful. That's wonderful. Lynn, I wonder if you would tell us a little bit about Square Books in Oxford, Mississippi. Snowden mentioned that it's a very literary town. Square Books itself and the Howarth family was profiled in the New Yorker last year. We're going to post a link in the chat so people can check that out. So it is an unusually well documented bookstore. But would you just say a few words about the store in the town for us?
Oh, sure. So, Richard and Lisa Howarth, who are the owners of the store, they started the store in 1979 on the Square Books, but it was on the second floor. I mean, they didn't even have any garage. And so they started off in a little small bookstore, and 6 years later, they moved into what is now sort of this iconic orange building. It's actually the colors to your eye. It's orange, and um, that was 1986, which was actually the time that I moved to Oxford to go to some graduate school. And for me, at that time, I was not a bookseller. It was, it was definitely a draw for Oxford, and I sort of naturally gravitated to the bookstore, and that's where I hung out. Well, besides the bars, but other than that, I spent a lot of time at the bookstore. And then, as the years went on, Square Books grew, and we opened Off Square Books, and which is our event space, and also it's our lifestyle and leisure store. We have gifts there, cooking and travel, and used and bargain books, and then Square Books Junior, a store just for kids. And then finally, on the 40th anniversary, we opened Rare Square Books, which is back on that second floor where Richard and Lisa first started the store in 1979.
That's fabulous. That's fantastic. Um, we're posting links to information about the store for the audience to look at. Encourage everybody to head to the store's website, support independent book selling, pick up a copy of American Pop if you haven't already. Snowden, for audience members who may not be familiar, American Pop is a multi-generational family narrative set against the backdrop of the soft drink industry in some ways. It is, I guess, somewhat nonlinear in structure. But I wonder if you would just sort of say, first of all, just a little bit about it for people who might not be familiar, and just give us your elevator pitch for the book, and then maybe just a few words about writing it.
Sure. The book began with a hypothetical premise. I asked myself, what would a novel about the Kennedys be like if they had made their fortune by inventing Coca-Cola? And so
that is how it reads. That's exactly how it reads. That works.
And so it follows this fictional family, the Forresters, through over 100 years of American cultural history via this soft drink company, the Panola Cola Company, that they founded and own. And because they are so wealthy and so socially and politically prominent in America, it allowed me to have them hobnob with people that a regular family would not have. And it also allowed me to explore what I think are very American themes. I mentioned earlier that I was writing the book in Oxford, but a lot of the time I would spend my weekends down on my family farm, which I live at now. I've since built a house there, but back at the time, I was living in this old shotgun cottage. This was not a fancy place. And the story behind it goes that back in the 80s, maybe in the 70s, my father bought this shotgun cottage for maybe a couple $1,000s and had it shipped to this hilltop on the farm. And he was so young, and it was his first major purchase as a young man. And so he was therefore so proud of it that he immediately got in his car and drove down the road to Yazoo City to his mother's house. And he said, "Mama, get in the car. I got something to show you." And the thing to know about my grandmother was that she was this old school Mississippi blue blood. She had since lost that wealth, as American families are wont to do, but she still had that bearing about her. And so my dad pulls up in front of this old shotgun cottage, runs around, opens the car door for his mother, and he says, "Look at this, Mom. This is mine. I bought this. I own this." And his mother takes a long drag of her cigarette and goes, "Charles, and that family burn house is nicer than this." And that story, along with the memory of stories like it, living in Mississippi while I was working on American Pop, really inspired me, because what is that? What is the essence of that story? Is the fluidity of wealth and class and socioeconomic status in America. And to quote Nathaniel Hawthorne, families are always rising and falling in America. And it really was inspiring to be back in my home state and to be back around my family and to have the memories that came up, which I salted throughout the book, little episodes of family lore. There was even one that at one point, when my parents were young, it was a Sunday afternoon, and my mom had spent the day cooking and cleaning and doing those stereotypical housewife things. And my dad was on the couch, and he just nonchalantly asked her to make sure that his blue shirt was ironed before work the next day. And so my mom had headed up to here with that. And so she went upstairs to his closet, gathered all his clothes, and tossed them onto the front lawn. Around that time, my grandmother, my mother's mother, pulls into the driveway for a visit, and she sees all these shirts on the lawn, and she's like, "What is going on?" So she starts picking up a few, put them in her arms, and she walks in, and my father immediately says, "Helen, did you see what your crazy daughter did?" At which point, my mother told her side of the story, and my grandmother intuited who was in the right, and so she immediately went back outside and started tossing the shirts back into the front lawn where they belonged. And so stories like that and other episodes of family lore really made their way into the book, so that even though it's highly fictionalized, it still has some seeds of my personal family lore that makes the book personal to me.
It's fantastic, and I think that really comes through in the writing. Many of the people who watch the show are themselves writers or are sort of aspiring writers. And this, I think, American Pop, I think, would be a daunting project, I think, for anyone, because of both sort of the scale of it, the multi-generational scale, sort of the sort of like epic scope to it, and also the structure. And I wonder if you would just sort of say something about your process in terms of, did you lay this book out beat by beat in outline form and then follow it through? Did you kind of have all of this material in terms of family stories and ideas about sort of a Kennedy soda empire, and then sort of struggle to knit them together in a coherent way? Could you just give us a sense of sort of what that process was and how long it took you?
There were a few inspirations for the book. Of course, there's Edward P. Jones's The Known World, which I love and is told in a nonlinear structure as well. Gabriel Garcia Marquez's 100 Years of Solitude. I always saw that as a direct inspiration. So instead of being set in South America, this is my 100 years set in the American South. And even with film, there were a few inspirations. Citizen Kane, Pulp Fiction, those are both told in nonlinear formats. So with that structure, I had to know the entire story front to back, and I had to know these characters' lives and the arcs of their lives front to back as well. And when I was starting the book, I knew I wanted to write a book about a large family, multi-generational, and about a soft drink company. So then I remembered my multiplication tables. In second grade, to learn how the numbers 0 through 12 multiply with each other, I came up with a mnemonic device via narrative. So every number between 0 and 12 had a place within a larger family and their own personality. So 10 was the father, 5 was the mother, 9 was the older brother, 7 was the hothead younger brother, 6 was the sister. All of these is very soap operatic. And when they were multiplied, in my weird little brain, my little second second grade brain, their product looked like an anecdote. And so even now, when I factor a tip at a restaurant, these little stories play out in my head. And so I realized I had I had my characters, and B, I had most of the plot right there. So all I had to do was transplant the numbers into the book. So it was almost like writing by math.
Mhm.
And that really allowed me to dice up the narrative by knowing when everything would happen. And therefore I was able to create juxtapositions that I considered more artful. And writers are always manipulating time. They could be dilating a small moment into 50 pages, or taking 50 years and covering that in one paragraph. So time is always being manipulated in fiction. And I was just taking that to a bit more of an extreme with this book in order, I felt, to make it more artful.
That's interesting. That's fascinating. Lynn, let me turn to you. The Forrester family is this sort of great epic Southern family, and they may be kind of inspired in some ways by the Kennedys, but they are unmistakably Southern. Square Books, of course. I mean, one of the stories about Square Books is I think you're very close to William Faulkner House, to Roanoke, and sort of the seat of sort of like great Southern literature. I wonder if you would sort of say something about this idea of Southern literature. Sort of what is it that makes a book sort of recognizably Southern? What are the characteristics? What does that label mean to you?
Thanks for the easy question.
Yeah, all yours, all yours. The mic is yours.
Well, I think what Snowden just said about, I just was laughing because I'm delighted to know that story about throwing the shirts out the window is true, because that was one of my favorite scenes in the book. So I'm glad that it came from a real life family experience. But, that sort of exemplifies Southern, a big influence on Southern writing is these, family histories and family storytelling that then, goes on to enter into Southern literature. But, it's so hard to say what is Southern literature, and other than that the people the writers are from the South, I don't really know what the answer to that is.
I think there's often sort of a darkness to it, I think. I think there's sort of this very particular quality to it with sort of like a shadow to it, or sort of a darkness to it, that comes through in some of those anecdotes. And, it's so difficult to articulate. We had the Arkansas writer Eli Craner on the show.
Oh, yeah.
Who wrote Don't Know Tough. And I don't think American pop is sort of Southern Gothic in the way that Don't Know Tough is. But, I said to Eli, your book is characterized as Southern Gothic. It's in all the reviews. What does that mean? And he said, yeah, the reviews came out and my dad called me up and he said, hey, these guys are saying your book's Southern Gothic. What's that? And he said, beats me, but, like people sort of seem to know it when they see it. I mean, I think it's sort of a particular flavor. It's a particular sensibility that I think has kind of captured Snowden in some of those anecdotes that you tell, the sort of drollness, but also the sort of darkness, I think.
Right. Well, happy stories are not very interesting, are they? So, so that darkness and that sort of, wry sensibility that, it's all almost a reveling in the tragedy and finding the humor in the dark places.
Yes, right.
That's the Southern characteristic.
I think that's exactly it. Yeah. Snowden, you were going to say something. Yeah.
And part of growing up here, if you have, Southern Gothic isn't some separate genre. It's just life for us. It's something that we saw every day. So you say like, oh, this is Southern Gothic. Like, oh no, this is just air. This is the world we live in.
That's a great point. That's a very northern perspective. I mean, I'm sure that those reviews were in like the New York Times, and I'm I'm sitting here in Massachusetts, sort of saying, oh yeah, it sort of seems very Southern Gothic. But you're right, it's for you, otherwise just known as life. I Snowden, I wanted to ask you about a particular aspect of this book that interested me. In my day job, I'm a clinical psychologist and work with people with disabilities. And oftentimes in my own writing, I try to capture the experience of people with disabilities. One of your, without giving away too much plot and sort of spoilers from American Pop, one of the sort of one of the Forrester children or adult children, Harold, sort of seems to have a developmental disability in this book. He's in a time and a place where maybe that's not sort of diagnosed the way that it might be today. But I wonder. I'm always very interested in how people approach writing such a character. If you felt like that was challenging. Um, I also think that our cultural sensibilities around disability and even the use of the word disability is changing very quickly. And I even wonder if you would find it more challenging to write Harold today than you did when you wrote this book.
I probably would find it more challenging. My advice went to any writer when they're writing not only a character like Harold, but whenever you're writing across identities, be it race, ethnicity, sexuality, you name it, there are two things that are important to keep in mind. First of all, have empathy. You should always have empathy for your characters. But the thing is, you should have empathy for every character, regardless of their identity or if they have a disability. The second thing is to not resort to cliches or stereotypes. And again, you should never resort to cliches or stereotypes with any of your characters. So if I were being snarky, my advice would be a good writer. In other words, apply the skills you should have as a writer to all of your characters, regardless of their identities and disabilities. And so with Harold, he was a tricky character to create, but I felt such empathy for him. In a lot of ways, he's the heart of the book, and he's the memory keeper for the Forsters. And so in some ways, he's my favorite character. But he holds a bigger place in my heart than I'd say pretty much any other of the Forster family. And so having that utter empathy for him was the biggest tool I had for creating him. And I hope I got it right. But yeah, I would have a bit more apprehension today than I did 5 years ago.
Yeah. I mean, I thought he was well written. I mean, I thought he seemed honest. I thought he was empathically written. I never felt like we were being set up as readers to laugh at him, or to find him ridiculous in some way. And I think that's the key. Am I sort of on the outside looking in and sort of judging this person, or is he written empathically, and am I kind of walking in his shoes? And I think the book was successful in putting me into his shoes. Lynn, I wonder if you have a perspective as a bookseller on this issue of representation, of the representation of characters with disabilities, of authors sort of writing across identities, of just sort of in a concrete sense in terms of what is on the tables in your store. If I walked into Square Books today, what would I find on the table, and would it be different from what I found 5 or 10 years ago?
So there is so much more diversity now in publishing, and I have to be honest, I was actually looking back at our events over many years ago, and back in the late 80s and the early 90s, it was most of the authors that came to the store were white, not all, but most, and there were some women writers, and of course in Mississippi, we have Ella Douglas and Eudora Welty, and Margaret Walker Alexander, and so we have some great women writers that we recognize as well, who are very important. And but for our events, there was definitely there was a predominantly white male, and I think, and that wasn't just Square Books going out and saying, "Oh, we're only going to have white males." I mean, that was kind of the publishing industry at the time. If you go back and look what was published in the early '90s, you'll see that predominance. And and there was really quite an active movement pushing for diversity in publishing. Gosh, I don't know. It began like 10 years ago, and I think that you could, if you had a time capsule and you walked around our store, Square Books today, and then went back 10, 15, 20 years ago, you definitely see a different sort of makeup. Also, works in translation have become a lot more available. There's much more that's been translated into English and then published in the United States. I mean, that was always a barrier that each country has its own really publishing system, and there are all these like little worlds, and they don't overlap very much. But we have a really very robust literature and translation section now, and so that adds to that. So it's culture, race, ethnicity, and it's gotten to be a lot more global too.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think that's absolutely true. Word to the audience, just briefly before we go on, we're here for one reason, and that is to support independent book selling. And this week, that means Square Books. Hop online. Do not go to a big box store. Do not go to that big online retailer. Head to Square Books website. We're putting the link in the chat. Pick up a copy of American Pop. Pick up a couple of other things. Support independent book selling. This is a message to people who are with us now, as well as people who are with us in future time. And while we're talking retail, I want to sort of talk to the two of you a little bit about kind of the industry aspect. Again, as I mentioned earlier, many of the people who watch this are writers or hope to be published writers. And it's often a unique opportunity to have not only a published author, but also an experienced bookseller. Snowden, I'm going to go to you first. I know that you are in the process of hurling yourself yet again into the teeth of the publishing industry with a third novel. So first, let me just give you the opportunity. I'd love to hear anything you would like to tell us about that novel, including a tentative title and any elevator pitch you might have.
Sure. This novel is a bit of a departure for me. It's a literary Southern Gothic crime novel about a Black female private investigator and her white male partner as they investigate a high-profile murder case in 1980s Mississippi.
Wow.
And, yeah. So I was inspired a lot by stories from growing up. My father was the district attorney in my hometown, and so he dealt with a lot of serious cases. There was even one time when one of the defendants that he was prosecuting escaped from jail and threatened to kill my dad's entire family. So I like to joke that I survived my first death threat when I was 2 years old. Maybe his first death threat, and he also tells me this story. And so the book is set in my hometown of Meridian, Mississippi, and the working title I have for it right now is Queen City, which is what Meridian is known as, because years and years ago, it was the #2 city in the state. But in digging into research about what it was like in the 1980s, a lot of it felt like the Wild West. There was this one story my dad told me. It was his first day on the job as DA. And so he's a 20-something, and it's lunchtime. And so he walks outside and he finds this hole-in-the-wall burger joint, walks in, orders a burger, And the clientele there are kind of rough looking folks. And so the burgers kind of like, they come in. Finally, this older man walks out of the kitchen and says, hey, are you the new DA? He says, yes, sir, I am. He says, step back in here with me. So he takes him back in the kitchen and he says, you're welcome to eat here anytime you want, but you're going to have to eat here back in the kitchen. And when you come in this place, you come in the back door. And my dad was like, well, why? And he said, you look out there, you see those lowlifes out there? Within a year, if you're as good as you say you are, you're going to put half of them behind bars. Who you are, one of them is going to put a knife in your gut, and son, it's not something I can abide.
Oh my God.
That's great.
And so his stories are very inspirational for this book that I'm working on. And just that sort of that Wild West feel. I've always been enamored with both crime fiction and Westerns. And so Elmore Leonard has always been a hero of mine. And if you know his career arc, he started writing Westerns and then moved into crime novels. And I think even with the crime novels, there was still the influence of Westerns, the archetypes of the sheriff and the gunslingers and things like that. And so with this book, I'm trying to wed those two things. And so it's really been a fun process. It's been a joy digging into the history of my hometown. And so I recently, just a few days ago, I had an editorial meeting with my editor, and I'm really excited to get started on the rewrites.
Fantastic. Wow. And the working title again is Queen City?
Queen City, that might not stick. We're still batting around a few other choices.
Titles are hard.
I'm excited, Snowden. Hurry up, okay?
I mean, it sounds unbelievable. One thing that strikes me about it, I wanted to ask you, speaking of career arc, you're talking about Elmore Leonard's career arc. I want to ask you about yours. I think Play Pretty Blues was with a smaller press. American Pop, I think, was under was a Big Five book, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Now it sounds like you're crossing genres. I don't quite know how to formulate this question, other than just sort of asking whether there's sort of a strategy that you're following with regard to your engagement with the publishing industry, as distinct from sort of your writing, the artistic aspect of your writing. Do you think about genre? Do you think about who's publishing? Or are you just sort of creating what you want to create and kind of letting the chips fall where they will?
I like genre malleability. Even with American Pop, there are elements of it that are a war novel, that are a romance novel, that are just classic historical novels. So I've never considered myself beholden to a single genre. Although I will say that this latest one is very much in the crime genre mold, although literary crime novel. And with it, I'm really trying to challenge myself to create a propulsive plot. And that's been really fun. But I would never want to be locked down to a single genre. And I don't know many writers who would. Why wouldn't you want to try your hand at everything? And so it's really been fun. And I'm so honored to be back with my same publisher from American Pop and my same editor, the wonderful Jessica Williams. She's been so supportive and has had so much faith in me since she took me on with American Pop. And it's just a pleasure being back with her. And I just trust her with this book and to know when to push me to do more with it and to know when I'm on the right track. And so having that kind of champion, also my agent, Eve Adderman, has been wonderful as well. Every book, every writer needs their champions. And so I've been very fortunate to have two. And I'm just so grateful.
Fantastic. A couple of audience questions coming in. Lynn, I'm going to bring the first one to you. And it is in regard to actually, I don't have the name of it, but the Mississippi Literary Festival that your store is involved with, or that is affiliated with your store, or if you can speak to that.
Well, so there is the Oxford Conference for the Book, which is it is March 29th through 31st, I think offhand, but the website is Oxford Conference for the Book. And that is something that we partner with and co-sponsor along with the Center for the Study of Southern Culture at the University of Mississippi. And it's a free conference, which is lovely. And it really is a non-academic conference. It is dedicated to readers. So I highly recommend that. But they may be talking about the Mississippi Literary Festival, which is in August in Jackson, Mississippi. And that is a one-day book festival, and it's at the Capitol, and it's always really sort of extraordinary. It's one of those where 4 different panels, and you are and decide who you want to hear speak. So there are always some wonderful speakers for that. And of course, and we have events. I will say that, Mississippi has so many writers, and a very rich literary tradition, and we like to celebrate that.
Well, I think that actually ties into this next audience question, which is a follow-up on our earlier conversation about Southern literature. And the question is, for either one of you, are there any favorite Southern writers that you would like to mention or give some love to?
Lynn, do you mind if I take this? I came
Please do, Snowden.
Prepare for the bit. See this? Barry Hannah, Airship.
Oh, there you go.
Airships. That is so cool. I want one of those.
Right? Yeah, that's a sartorial commitment to the bit right there.
You're totally committed. And I think what the audience doesn't know, Snowden, is you're up in Maine. So, I mean, you are just like, you're representing.
Yeah, gotta represent.
So Barry Hannah, yeah.
When I came to Oxford, Mississippi in the 80s, and I'd never really spent time in North Mississippi. And I will admit I was prejudiced. I had kind of, my idea of this wasteland, with a bunch of pine trees all over it. And and I was in college and I read Airships. And then I realized that Barry Hannah was at the University of Mississippi and lived in Oxford. And I was like, this place is got to be a wonderful place if this writer is there, because that is one of my favorite books ever. And Barry Hannah sadly is no longer with us. But he helped nurture a lot of writers following him, and helped create the MFA program at the University of Mississippi. And so beyond his own work, he's left a real legacy. And I'm sure he's influenced Snowden as well. So.
Absolutely. He was actually born in my hometown. He didn't grow up there, but he was born, I think, in some hospital there. So I always took inspiration and thinking like, well, that guy Hannah could do it. Maybe I could.
Snowden, as long as we're sort of talking books and talking authors we love and talking commercial, if there are any books that you're reading right now that you'd like to recommend to the audience, we'd love to hear about them. And to the audience, I want to remind you that as Snowden mentions, books or authors he's loving, we're going to be posting links for you to pick up a copy at one place and one place only, and that is Square Books. So click the links and pick up a copy from Square Books. Snowden, what are you reading?
I've been reading homework for the book I'm writing. So it's a crime novel and a PI novel. Some recent favorites, Sam Lipsyte, who was a professor of mine in grad school, he recently came out with, I believe the title was No One Is Left to Come Looking for You, which I will call a PI novel, even though it's more of an amateur sleuth novel about a musician in 1990s New York. And I kind of fell in love with it because everybody who lives in New York, they kind of romanticize the era of New York right before they got there. And so his book takes place in the era right before I got there. And it's a PI novel in the same way that The Big Lebowski is a PI movie. It's a guy who's kind of thrust into being a PI. So I found that interesting, and it has his classic humor. Another book is S.A. Cosby's Razor Blade Tears, which has a similar format, a partnership at the heart of it that's similar to the book I'm writing. And I really like his style in that you could tell he grew up like me in the 80s, watching a lot of 80s action movies. And so, in the best way. And so, he lets that inspire him. And I guess one last one will be C.J. Hauser's The Crane Wife. I had the privilege of doing a talk with her at Square Books this past summer, and hers is nonfiction. And it's just a wonderful book. And she's an old friend. We were in a writing group together in New York before either of us were published. And so I'm so proud to see her succeed.
It's fantastic. Yeah, and Razorblade Tears is an unbelievable novel. And speaking of movies, I have to say some of your name checks on 90s films I think are dead on. I think when you mentioned Pulp Fiction as sort of an influence on American pop, I was like, oh yeah, that actually really works. That's perfect. Yeah, absolutely. Lynn, any books you'd like to recommend, authors you want to put out there that you're excited about right now?
Well, sure. But first I want to comment on Snowden's reading, which is, I mean, that this is what makes a really good writer, is being a really good and voracious reader. To go from Homer to Cosby is pretty amazing. And that's really evident in American pop too, that I learned a lot of things. It's such a deep and wide book, and has so many stories in it that some of them, I found out are true. But as far as reading, so one thing about being a bookseller is that we are always reading ahead. So I am reading books that are coming out in May or June, or even on into the fall. And sometimes it's a little bit, to pull back to get back to what's in the store now. But I'm not going to, because I want to talk about some Oxford writers. We're so fortunate, and Snowden among them, that we've had this great community of Oxford writers. And I think what happens is writers are attracted to each other, and as there are more writers in town, it gets more of a literary reputation, and more people come, and it's nice to be able to go to happy hour and be able to talk about books with people and what they're working on. But there are two really good writers who have books coming out in April, and one is Michael Ferris Smith, and he has a book called Salvage This World, and talk about noir. It is what they briefly referred to as like very fashionable, talk about grit lit, but it is kind of a dark world. It's set in Mississippi after climate change has progressed, and they're just hurricanes after hurricanes after hurricanes, and so that is very it's very dark and atmospheric, and it's sort of a sequel to his book that he did called Rivers some years ago, and that's coming out in April. And we'll be, of course, be having an event for that. And then, the week before his book comes out, Lee Durkee, who wrote a novel called Last Taxi Driver, has a book called Stalking Shakespeare, where he goes way deep down this rabbit hole about, who was Shakespeare and what did he look like, and addresses all the, you know, I don't want to call it conspiracy theorists, but all the theories that people have about that. And he travels to England to try to track this down. And so it's a combination memoir and narrative about the history of Shakespeare, which is pretty interesting.
Oh my God, that sounds fantastic. All right, well, I mean, good job, the two of you, with those book recs. Those all sound unbelievable. And a reminder to the audience to use the links that have been popping up in the chat. Go to Square Books online and pick up any or all of those books, as well as, thank you, yes, professional bookseller move, as well as American Pop by Snowden Wright. It's been such a complete pleasure speaking to the two of you. This time has flown by, and it's just been completely delightful. Snowden, cannot wait for your third novel, tentatively titled Queen City. Might change, but we very much look forward to that coming out. Lynn, complete pleasure to speak with you, and I hope to make it to Oxford, Mississippi one of these days and to visit Square Books, because it sounds like a unique literary destination. So thank you so much for being here with us. To the audience, thank you, as always, for joining us. Thank you for supporting Authors Love Bookstores with a mighty blaze. If you like the show, please subscribe online, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter. Join us 2 weeks from today for our 126th episode with writer Alex Jennings at Tubby & Coo's Mid-City Bookshop. And until then, support independent book selling, be well, and keep reading. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.